Welcome to the CEO series. Our guest today is Minda Harts, LinkedIn top voice, best-selling author of the Memo, which is what we will be discussing today. She's a professor at New York University Wagner. She hosts a weekly podcast called Secure the Seat, which we'll also be discussing. She was named one of the top voices for equity in the workplace by LinkedIn. Her work has been featured in all of the top magazines. She's appeared on all of the major business shows in New York. So with that, welcome, Minda. How are you?
Hi, Ron. Good to see you. Thank you for the warm introduction.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. I've been looking forward to this. It's been a while since we last spoke. I've been reading so many things about your book. I've seen comments on LinkedIn concerning it. So let's talk about that for a second. So walk us through the process that you went through to write this book. When did that insight come in to say, I need to put pen to paper?
Yeah, thank you for that. You know, it's funny. Yesterday was Toni Morrison's birthday, and she said, write the book you want to read. And that's one of the things that I started to think about when I read a lot of business books and career books. They were typically from the perspective of a white male or white women, but we hadn't had many books written by women of color about our experiences in the workplace. And I really started to interrogate and investigate, yes, what do we mean when we say women in the workplace, and who are we talking about? And I often felt like my experience was left out of the conversation, or it was an asterisk or an afterthought. And I really wanted to center the experiences of women of color in the workplace, because we experience the workplace a little bit different than some of those in the dominant majority. And I felt like it was time for us to have something we could read about and center our story, so that our colleagues and our managers can also know what it's like sometimes when you're showing up in the workplace as one of the only or one of few.
Yeah, the first, which we hear so often. So what triggered it? I mean, you said that you were thinking about putting pen to paper, writing the book that you want to read, and it just kind of took off from there.
So what triggered it initially was in 2012. So my book the first version of the book didn't come out until 2019, but it was in 2012 where I started to really think about, I was living in Los Angeles at the time, and it was around the Trayvon Martin time period here in the United States. And I started to really think about what it means to Black lives to matter outside, but also inside the workplace. And I started to think about just the inequalities that Black people face in the workplace. And a year later, I was reading Sheryl Sandberg's book, Lean In, and I was going through my own inequalities inside the workplace, microaggressions, macroaggressions, however some people like to define them. And it really was a very sobering time for me, and a very painful time to experience some of those inequalities as the only one in the workplace. And I really wanted to shine a light and help others who feel like they don't have the support that they need to keep moving forward in the workplace. And I didn't want them to defer their dreams because of toxic work environments. So I really thought about how I could be part of the solution.
Okay. Did you collaborate with your workmates or other people of color in putting this together, getting insights from outside of your sphere?
I did. So when I was working in my corporate role in my former life, I didn't have the pleasure of always working with people who looked like me. But when I started my company, the Memo LLC, in 2015, I was helping so many different women of color prepare for their seat at the table, navigate the workplace politics that sometimes we experience inside the workplace. And I started to interview and have conversations with hundreds of women of color that were having similar experiences as being the only one or one of few, and feeling like they just didn't have the support that they needed, like some of their colleagues had.
Okay. Support, key word. Support as in your manager, support as well as the organization. And this is what I've noticed from the Floyd and all of the discussions today, is that everyone is taking pen to paper, creating a great letter to the audiences of the organizations about what they're going to do, how they're going to do things differently. I tend to look at that with a side eye, because I said, in the heat of the moment, everybody puts out a missive concerning that. But in 6 months to a year, it's going to go back to the same thing.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think that this is where we have the opportunity to, well, fortunately or unfortunately, we have the opportunity to hold our leaders and hold our colleagues accountable, because I think, to your point, we have these very intense conversations and everybody has the platitudes that we're going to do better,
Yeah.
equity, diversity, inclusion matters. And then we go back to, like you said, business as usual. But I think that now we have the opportunity to really make good decisions that make work for everybody. And it's going to take all hands on deck. It can't take just, people of color pushing the agenda. It has to be our allies and our managers and our leaders as well, to make sure that we don't just have this conversation yearly and then move on, right?
Yeah. Yearly, every few years, something pops up and everybody's back at the trough talking about it again.
Yeah.
So what advice would you give to, so it says women of color, so I'm going to assume people of color. Would that be appropriate to say that?
Yeah, I think so. One of the things I think sometimes our unconscious bias would say, oh, that book's just for them, right? But when we talk about equity in the workplace, how can we be a support system from someone who might identify differently if we haven't read about their experiences, right? How can we be a manager who manages diverse talent and not read about some of the experience that some of the people on our team might be experiencing? So it centers the experiences of women of color, but definitely people of color have had any type of racial aggression inside the workplace can definitely resonate with it. But then also, again, like I said, our leaders, our CEOs, those who say they want a workplace that works for everybody, you have to understand what some of the experiences might be of those who you support.
Okay. So I had a discussion with a young lady that I coach the other week, and she had just gotten a new job, and she was there for maybe 3 weeks, and they said, you know what, you're not the right fit. But it all came back from a conversation we had with an out of control manager, and she was trying to create dialogue with that manager, and that was one of the untouchables, and they basically sacrificed her in a matter of a month to do that. But meanwhile, they're saying all the right things, the purpose driven and all of that. So from the organization perspective, how can an organization, what should an organization do to bring this discussion to the forefront, or maybe open it up beyond the conversation that happened after an incident to keep it alive?
Yeah, I love that you brought this question up, Ron, because I think it happens to a lot of us. I know in my former life, I had taken a role and they said the same thing, right? Diversity is important, inclusion. And I was excited about that because I believed what they said to be true, right? On the walls and in the halls. And then once I got there, within a year, I did become the sacrificial lamb, and I ended up having to leave. And I think that so many people of color experience that, right? We have our colleagues, our leaders tend to have more empathy for the people causing harm, those colleagues, those managers, than the person receiving the harm. And I think we really have to say, okay, is this the type of environment we want to perpetuate? And if that's true, then, say that at the beginning, right? But pretend that this is an environment that is inclusive. And the other part of it, if we do say that we want inclusive work environments, then we have to normalize that those people don't belong. They're not a good fit, right? Those who are causing harm are not a good fit in this environment, so that we can retain and attract diverse talent. And I think that I think that's a problem with retainment in the workplaces. Oftentimes people of color are on the receiving end of that, racial trauma or aggression or lack of support. And then again, we have to go find another place, whereas that person just continues to perpetuate a system of oppression in the workplace. And so I think we really have to have a hard conversation and say, not everybody should be managing, right? Do the managers have the tools they need to actually support the people they work with?
Yeah, I read an interesting white paper the other day concerning managers, selection of managers. When did we begin training them? And the conclusion of the organization was go down further to the first level supervisor and begin that training, begin that awareness, and you build that all the way up. So by the time, and if they're around and they reach that level, they are more inclusive, they understand different perspectives inside of the organization. But we tend to wait. I think this figure was like 9 to 10 years within an organization before they started investing in leadership development, which was sad.
It is so sad. When I wrote the memo, Ron, and I was interviewing women of color, 70% of them said that they felt like their managers were not invested in their success, which is very high, and it's a very sad number. And I think it is a direct correlation to who we see advanced and who we don't, right? Who's promoted and who's not. Because if your manager's not invested in your success, it's very rare that you're going to have those opportunities to advance. And so I do think that our managers need to be equipped with EQ, with how to have, critical conversations, etc. I think there's a lot of work instead of just promoting people that don't have the business acumen to do so.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Soft skills side, soft skills, huge today. Empathy. KPMG just fired their managing director from the UK, I think it was earlier this week, because he made a very insensitive comment that people need to get over COVID, get back to life, get over it, deal with it. Very, very blunt. But I applaud KPMG to say, we don't do that here. And he was let go as a result of that.
We need more of that. We need more of that courageous leadership to say, no, that's not okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So when we talk about at that level, so you're down to maybe the manager's level and someone is managing people from that level. If I'm acting out, but if the organization is sending a signal that we don't act out here, that probably will cascade down. But a lot of times I think it's lost in translation when you have layers and layers, across the organization, and it doesn't quite get down to the bottom, because it could be, well, that person drives 90% of our business in that region. We can't let them go.
Yeah. I mean, that's true, because even in my personal experience, I was up against that same thing. The person who I was having this conflict with, even though everyone in the office knew that this was a problem, they're like, this is our top performer, right? We're not letting this person go. And so I think they sacrifice an inclusive environment, and they sacrifice perpetuating a toxic work environment that they're never going to be able to retain diverse talent when you send that signal that we prefer revenue over, when it can be yes and, right? We can have top performers, and we can have an environment in which people feel psychologically safe in.
Yeah, if we create it.
If we create it.
If we create it. The other point is that, so we talked about organizations, and at that so-called seat at the table, I hate that phrase, but I know what you mean when you say that, at that geographical spot inside of that conference room, how do you make a business case for diversity, equity, and inclusion? We see the stats from Wall Street that shows that companies that have this will generate this, but that doesn't seem to make a difference, because when you look at the makeup of boards, you look at the makeup of C-suites, how do you make a business case?
Well, I think
the business case.
You hit it on the head, Ron. The business case has already been laid out. I mean, I don't know how many more publications and papers need to come out that diversity is good for business. It really next is it's the intentionality, right? Now that we know that it's good for business, our leaders have to decide if this is what they want to demonstrate, right? If they want to demonstrate, because it's one thing to say diversity is important, we're committed to equity, but then if I go to your About Us page and I don't see that reflected, I'm going to think twice about applying for this position. And then you're going to sit and twiddle your thumbs thinking, well, why aren't we, it's a pipeline issue. No, it's not a pipeline issue.
Yeah.
It's an intentionality issue. And I think that those companies that win at the end of the day are going to be the ones that walk it and talk it. And those companies that are still sitting there saying we can't find anybody, I think you're going to find that they're always going to have a problem. And I think, diverse talent needs to find those places in which are demonstrating that equity and diversity is important.
I'm smiling because when you said, we can't find them here.
Yeah.
We can't find that talent. I immediately reverted back to Wells Fargo when the CEO made that statement. And what I thought about when I heard him making that statement, I could just imagine the feeling of letdown that people were so-called in that leadership pipeline. And for the leader to say, it's just hard to find these people.
Yep.
And you have a whole pool of people that you're investing all this money in, in doing that. Any comments on that? Were you referring to the Wells Fargo situation?
I was referring to that situation because, you know, as people of color, we're so frustrated, right, when we hear that, because we're like, we're here, but you don't consider us. You're not viewing us as an asset, right? And I think that's the problem, because so many have not seen, you know, diverse talent in leadership positions. They feel as though, well, maybe you know, you're not ready or whatever have you, but that's a narrative that we can no longer subscribe to. And again, like I said, for those companies who have committed and demonstrated, those are the ones that will have the longevity. They'll have they'll be the proof, the evidence of the business case. But I think we're past it, Ron. Like I'm tired of trying to convince people that this is a must have.
Yeah. I know exactly what you mean. So I was reading, you know, as you know, I'm in Dubai, and I was reading all of the press releases that companies were putting out post George Floyd. And I tend to go to About Us, the same as you mentioned that. I said, okay, you said, oh, wow, that's cool. About Us. Nope. And I go away from it. So I would say to leaders who's listening here that you know, that's maybe sitting in that room at that table, be sure you live, eat, breathe, and sleep that, because before you get up and start making all these pronouncements, check yourself first.
Yep.
To make sure you're exhibiting what you're wanting everyone else in your organization to do. And you're thinking of a hiring manager, but look at your team. I had a situation post George Floyd, and one of my former CEOs wrote this beautiful piece. And I called her out on it. I called her out on it because I said, here's what happened in this situation that we were involved in. And I pointed out an incident that had happened, and she didn't respond to me. Mm. And I was really I was upset, and I wasn't upset, because I said, now, if you're willing to go out and put this together and send it out to probably hundreds of thousands of people, here's a small issue. Can we talk through that?
Yep.
And was not so-called man enough to step up and say, you know what, here's why that happened, or my mistake, whatever.
Yeah. Well, you know, I commend you for actually sending the email and making this person aware, because I think that this is the point, right? It's the performative allyship, it's the performative empathy, right? A lot of companies thinking that it's enough just to put out the statement, but not actually have any there. And when you do say, hey, well, let's look at About Us, it's easy for us to point to, for companies to say, oh, look what Wells Fargo did, right? How could they say that? But have you taken a look at what's going on inside of your company, right? It starts at home. And I think that people, you know, we look at ourselves as really good people, Ron, and we can't be this and that, but you know, it starts with us. And I think if we all start with those everyday actions, what's within our control, that we really could change the workplace. Because one thing that we saw was true in 2020 is that prior to COVID-19, I'd be consulting for corporations, and they'd say, oh, Minda, we can't do that. That's another 5 to 7 years, you know, out of the strategic plan. But in 2020, Ron, we've seen a lot of movement very quickly. So that shows me that we're able to be agile, right? We can move when we want to. So I'm hoping that companies will continue that this year.
Yeah, well, you know, I'm glad you mentioned that, because COVID, a CEO here told me, he said, never let a good crisis go to waste. So what can you learn from that? And what can you do better post, if there is such thing as a post-COVID, in trying to put something together? So he said every day he takes notes as to who's stepping up, who probably needs further development. He said, because when I come out of this, I'm going to create a totally different leadership team and a totally different way to develop my next level of leaders. And that's what he pulled out of this lockdown, when we were pretty much, I'm going to say 2020 in that period. So you use that and move forward. So this is what I thought about when you mentioned that. You said, you know, they're saying all these things, but then they're not doing it. So in leadership development, we talk about self-awareness. Are you aware of the effects you're having on organization?
Yep.
But are you aware of the effects that your organization has on people's careers within? And I applaud the glass doors of the universe, that people are able to come in and speak their minds and say what they need to say.
Yeah.
Because I think organizations should spend more time trying to listen as opposed to always standing up preaching about what we're going to do and here's who we stand for and all those things. Any thoughts on that?
I wish I had a tambourine, Ron, because I'd say amen to it, because I think that's the main point. Even last year or even this year, when we're dealing with some of the inequalities and leaders are speaking up on it, it's they're saying what they think people want to hear, right? But then there's no accountability, and I hope that people will really take a step and say, hey, I might not be able to change my entire company or organization that I work for, but what can I do on my team? What's within my sphere of influence, right? The next open position I have, am I being intentional about who's on the hiring state? The next opportunity that we have for diversity supplier, are we making sure that we're leveraging, people of color who have small businesses? I think that people and leaders really have to understand that they are the change that their company needs to see.
In talking about business leaders, DEI, what are some things that you see popping up? And I mean, the book has been out a while. You've gotten a lot of feedback. You've got clients who are looking for your services to try and come in and right the ship, shall we say. What are some themes that's coming up from the ground?
Yeah, well, we've been talking a little bit about it, but really the leadership development, because a lot of it's not all of the problem, but a good portion of the problem is management, supervisors, those who are managing teams who don't necessarily have the leadership development, the training to really invest in every person on their team. I often ask our leaders that I work with, I said, when was the last time you asked your staff, what do you need from me to do the best work of your career while you're here? And they all look at me like, virtually, like, wow, I never even considered that, right?
Yeah.
Let's talk about what skills we need in our team.
Let me make note of that so I can do it in the next team meeting. Yeah.
Yes. It's those sorts of things, asking the tough questions and maybe even getting answers that we're not prepared for. But that's where we start. You said it, Ron, listening. And that's what I am talking about inside of the companies. Like, talk with your team. They're on the ground. They're hearing the customers. They're, hearing the day to day. They're able to help you with the problem solving and the solutions. We can't be in our ivory towers and make decisions when we haven't actually talked to the people who are in it every day and who experience this. And again, it doesn't mean that we're bad people because we're not doing X, Y, and Z. It means we can be better leaders when we have all of the information and the tools to be successful.
So leadership, fixed mindset, growth mindset. So if we're talking about trying to be a better leader, and you didn't even resonate when it didn't resonate with you when I mentioned in asking that question. Could it be because of the leaders that are in that role, or could be from a different generation? Could be a whole host of other DNAs behind it, has been around and been leading for 30 years, and I figure I know everything, or because lots of times we run into that when you're talking with a leadership team. I always want to get a sense of what's the average age of the team, what's the average tenure of the team I'm working with, because that gives me a little more insight. Nothing definitive, but it gives me a little insight as to how I'm going to approach that. Yeah,
no, I agree with you. I think that it's a host of things, and not just one thing. But I do think that that's part of leadership development. Not just, I love the story that you told about the CEO who's looking at their organization differently and taking notes. And I think that that's the type of leadership that we need. Those can say, just because we've been doing it this way doesn't mean it's what's going to take us into the future of work. And I think those are the kind of questions that we have to ask ourselves. And yes, it might mean that the table looks a little different because we need different skills. We need different perspectives at the table to solve this next level issues that are arising in the workplace. And I think that, that's just about the upskilling, right? What do we have? Just like, if you had a certain skill set in 1985, it may be a little bit different than 2021. Doesn't mean that we still can't use you as a leader, but what have you done to invest in yourself to make sure that you are adding value? And I think that part is companies just operate in a very archaic kind of realm when it comes to leadership, and it's like, no, we have it's changing. Leadership is changing and evolving, and we have to as well.
I got chills when you said 1985. I'm like, you have a seat. You have got so much to learn. I mean, from that era. So let's turn this around somewhat. So we talk about leadership development. We talk about the top of the organization. Let's talk about women specifically.
Mm-hmm.
How can an organization listen more for women? Should we set up listening pods or pools or affinity groups for women leaders? Would they be developed any different than the regular leadership development, or what should we add? Or
yeah, I think that's a great question. I think a lot of companies are starting to have, leadership and management programs for women, which I think is important. But if you're not leveraging that talent, then those are just another initiative that goes nowhere, right? It's just like certain employee resource groups. You have these great pool of talent, but a lot of companies are not tapping those volunteer leaders for the next level of development. So I think we have to be intentional. But the other part that I'll say, as women, I think that we also too have a part to play. And that means that we have to articulate our value and quantify our worth, right? I know for me, when I came into corporate America, I got this one piece of advice, Ron: work hard and keep your head down. And yes, work hard is great, but when you keep your head down, nobody knows what you're doing, right?
Yeah,
the people you need to know. So I think that we have to make ourselves visible. We have to let people know. If you do have a manager that's not demonstrating that they're invested in your success, then let them know what you need to do, what you need from them, right, to do the best work of your career. So I think we do also have a role to play, because once we have those conversations, then we can make better decisions on if this company is good for us, or do we need to find another one that, is a better fit for us.
Yeah. That was a 1985 quote, by the way. Come in, do good work, keep your head down. Because if you lift it up, you're going to get chopped off. Yeah. Oh wow, yeah. But I've seen separate development programs for women leaders, and I look at it two ways. I said, why separate? You should have other people within the organization involved in that same type development opportunity. So I have a big question mark on separating it out.
Yeah.
Because I want you to not look at it as just for this segment, but what about if 90% of the people are over here that's making all the decisions? So is it self-esteem? Is it confidence building? And if so, why do we need that separately from any other program we have in L&D?
Yeah, I think you raised some really great questions. And I think the reason why we have to sometimes separate it out is to your point, because so many of our organizations have a very male-dominated leadership, board, council, management. And so I think that in order to really make the change, we have to be intentional, and we have to be, I hate to use the word grooming or developing women so that they have the opportunity to lead as well. But, what I really think is most important is not necessarily all of the leadership development programs. It's actually hiring more women of color. Like, that is the part. And then from there, once you've put them in, you can start to continue to develop them. But I think that half of the issue is just we're not having the access to the opportunity. So, I feel like more programs just delays what we actually need to do, which is actually hire and promote and retain women. But we have to actually be invested. Our managers have to be invested in their success for that to happen.
You mentioned the word confidence, and it kind of triggered a thought. That young lady told me, an executive for a company in Asia. She said her first C-level meeting, she had to make a presentation. She said, Ron, I didn't sleep for 2 days. And I said, that's normal. Yep. I mean, there's nothing to say that's negative about that. People that speak for a living, such as you and I, there's still some butterflies before you get up on the stage as they're going through the introduction. So I say you use that to propel the message, to create more charisma when you're talking it through. So if I say that to say, if I'm going into that meeting, that seat at the table, I've got to have something to offer. I've also heard stories of people that were a part of the table, and they were asked that their services were no longer needed at the table because they never brought anything to the table.
Yep. Yeah. Well, oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead, because having the seat is great, but how do I maintain that and be relevant?
Yep. I love that question, Ron. And our in the United States, our former First Lady, Michelle Obama, she said, don't just, we've been too happy just to be, grateful to be at the table that we're too scared to shake it up. And I think that I agree with that. It's like, if you have the opportunity to add value to the table or ideas or a program, then this is your shot. This is your opportunity. Because if there aren't any women, there aren't any people of color, then you're right now that one. And I know it's a lot of pressure, but you actually have to add value and show that you're the right person to be in this room. And I think for so long, because we haven't been a part of some of these conversations, we question ourselves. And that's where sometimes that imposter syndrome comes in. But we've worked hard to get here. We belong in these rooms, but we just have to demonstrate that as well. And that's with anything, right? Any type of work that we do, we want to do it with excellence. We want to show our value. So I would encourage women, people of color, anybody who has been invited, promoted into that room, to show why you're there, right? Mm-hmm. And leverage that opportunity, because that's only going to be better for your career. And so don't be afraid to give that insight, give that perspective, because you're there for a reason.
You mentioned a strong wording, imposter syndrome.
Yep.
For people that are listening, everyone suffers from that. It's not like, I don't really believe that you ever get to a point where you can just completely block that out. Specifically, if you're going into a new environment, new company. So it's kind of a natural, and you just look to build on that. Is that the correct way to look at that imposter syndrome?
That's how I look at it. That's how I look at it, because I feel it in many times, especially when I left my former life, Ron, and then I moved into this new role of like consulting and public speaking. I was like, wait a second, I don't have as much experience as some of the people who are in these rooms. I really questioned, but I realized I had to remind myself that I also have a perspective, a point of view. I also have some expertise. And so I can't do it the way that Ron does it. I have to do it the way that Minda does it. And that's why they invited me in the room. But I always have to do that self-talk and remind myself of that.
Yeah, self-talk, clutter. Yeah. There's a new book I'm reading now. It's called Clutter. That inner voice. Master the voice, you master yourself. So as you said, we all kind of go through that. And you mentioned your situation and people or a particular session, you're giving a speech. I remember a story that I had to moderate a panel, and I looked at the title of the people, and I'm like, oh my goodness, see this. And I'm thinking about this, but I took that concentrated and said, this audience, I've got to ask better questions. So I used the difference in that and said that I have to create a script for them to tell a story and work it through there. So I took the imposter syndrome and turned it into fuel to enable me to go in and do this session. And the session was great. I mean, we all had a great time laughing. It wasn't kind of one of these stuffed shirts kind of thing. So maybe is that a way to take it and look at it that way and capture what you can, turn around, repurpose it, and use it as fuel to get over that hump?
Yes, absolutely. I love that story. And I think that's going back to what you said. It's the stories that we tell ourselves about ourselves, right? Taking the narrative back that, oh, I don't know why they chose me. I don't know if I have the same expertise, or I'm not at the same level, and saying, wait a second, actually, I do add a different perspective. I do have value. And how can I turn what is perceived to be this like really intensive anxiety situation that I'm now put in and make it to my benefit? And I'm so happy that you shared that story, because I think that we forget that we hold so much power. And when we don't tap into our superhuman power and our strengths, then we leave room for that imposter syndrome. And imposter syndrome, it can't go where we're headed, right? We constantly have to leave that behind, because we're not going to be able to live our best career lives if we keep bringing it to every situation.
Yeah, you're correct with that. So the memo, the next version, proverbial next version of the memo, if you had to update it now, post George Floyd, what would you add to it? Is there anything else you would add based on the trajectory of when it came out and is going through, this time period?
Yeah, I love that question. I would probably add a whole nother chapter for managers only, because I
Okay.
think that so many managers during the George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, etc., don't want to talk about race. They're still not comfortable having those
Yeah.
conversations. And in order to have an inclusive and diverse environment and invested in every employee, you're going to have to talk about some of those critical issues that are affecting some of your team members. And so you can't pretend that those things are not happening. And so I think that some managers just need, again, the training and the tools and the development to be able to show up for their staff in the ways that everybody needs them to.
Yeah, well, the secret to that is what you just said, training and development. Because if I don't feel comfortable in having a conversation, somebody has to coach me through that.
Yeah.
But then again, that comes from an organizational perspective to say, we're going to provide this. So in order that we could be able to move the needle here and start having these discussions. So I go back to the business case behind it. Maybe there has to be some investment to have some return.
Always, right? That's how it goes. And if we think that we aren't going to invest in our managers or our people and expect that magically all of our problems from last year disappear,
Yeah.
we're just
doesn't work that way.
We're just going to keep having them.
Yeah, it doesn't work that way. Yeah, you're right. So what advice would you give to young women who are coming into the workplace post-COVID? And I say that, and I feel sorry for the generation that graduated last year, because they really have walked into something that's just unbelievable. But for people who are young women specifically, who are just entering the workforce, as you know, I'm based in the Middle East, and the female situation here is a little different depending upon the country, but they're just coming into the workplace. What advice would you give them as they enter these organizations with so many people, maybe a lack of confidence, and all these things they're being bombarded with, but meanwhile they have to do this job to keep doing what they want to do? What advice? Give me 3 things that you would give them to walk in a little more confident to grow.
This is a great question, and it's tough. I wouldn't want to trade places, but in some ways I might, because I think it goes back to what we were talking about. What can you leverage out of this situation? This is a new paradigm that a lot of young people are moving into, and this is their new normal, right? Their first job was in a virtual working from home environment. And so when we were in the office, the traditional workplace, we could be seen. We could have those organic water cooler moments and whatnot. But in this way, you're actually more visible, have the opportunity to be more visible to people than you might have been before, because now you're on video conferences with C-suite leaders that you might never have been in the same room with before. And so what I would say is, don't forget to build your social capital inside the workplace, even virtually, right? If you need to show up to meetings a little bit earlier on the virtual so that people see your name, they see your face, right? Use the chat when somebody's talking about something, chime in so that people get used to seeing your name. These are all opportunities that we can leverage. And then the next thing, so build your social capital. You can still do that online. Number 2, ask your manager, tell them what you feel like you need to be successful in this role, and really ask for that partnership, because you want to move up and have your goals. And then lastly, think about your 30, 60, 90-day goal. There's a great book called The First 90 Days. I can't think of the gentleman that wrote it. I would say add that to your toolkit, because those first 90 days are so important, but you continue to build off of that so that you continue to grow in your career. And don't think just because and then lastly, that the mindset. So 4, I like, or the mindset, the stories that we tell ourselves about ourselves. Don't say that you can't be successful in this time period. Don't think that you can't move up. People are still getting promotions. They're still getting advanced in this virtual environment. And that could be you as well when you continue to invest in yourself as well.
Okay. We got a question that came in from my dear friend in London, Jermaine, who's with the NBA, who also was a guest here. He says, excellent discussion, Ron and Minda. Question for you both. Do we hurt the efforts of women advancing in the corporate world by making too much of a distinction between the plight of Black women and women in general?
Yeah, I love that question. Thank you, Jermaine. I think we have to. I think intersectionality is critical right now because what we see in corporate America is that we talk about women advancing. Oftentimes we'll say, even in December, there was a report that came out and said women are the most affected. They've lost jobs during COVID. But then when you peel it back, it was really Black women and like Latinx women. It wasn't white women. White women have actually done better during 2020 in the workplace. And so we have to make those distinctions so that we can advance the groups that need it most, right? Invest in some of the groups that need it most so that we get the return on our investment. So I think because we haven't made those distinctions, so many groups are left out of the career narrative when we don't say who we're talking about and being specific. That's in my opinion. What about you, Ron?
Yeah, mine is kind of in the same light that you're talking about, because I look at it that when we think about women in general, there's a subset. So we're talking about, women of color. But I think emphasis has to be on women and leadership and development, and that subset that says we're not represented here, and maybe we need more people that look like these people to make this the I is inclusive of the workplace. Because if you look at the DNA of a workforce, if you were to break it down by certain categories, you would see there's a severe deficiency in a lot of organizations. So whereas we want to cover this from the post-trauma experience with all the stuff that's happened, analyze your organization. Where are you, even as it relates to the people that were more aligned to this particular issue? And we have an honest discussion around that. We have an honest discussion with the C-suite. If you have a chance to, if you have an opportunity to write all these communications and send them out, how many people were in the room to help you craft that? Because when I read a lot of them, I said, this was the same kind of old boy network that could probably put all these things together. The PR people came in and made sure everything was done, and they checked off on it, and that was it, and moving it forward. So I look at it, Jermaine, as kind of a two-pronged process. And for people that may feel that we're just concentrated on one segment, this affects the entire organization. It affects the entire organization.
Yep.
So there was another question here from Oman and women in general. So that's the Middle East. Different kind of perspective. They're, in a lot of cases in the Middle East, they're just entering the workforce. Specifically that segment that I've talked about, the 2020 graduates, or even say the 3 to 4 years before that. And I know because I talk with a lot of them, and they're struggling. They're struggling in being heard. But again, that comes back to the entire leadership perspective inside of the organization. So what I will tell them is that you keep on doing what you're doing, and your organization is going to have to realize that part of that development process for leaders, that's going to have to be inclusive, because if this is all new territory, you have to kind of shift the mindset of people who are making those decisions. So I hope that kind of helps you as it relates to that. Yeah. So we've kind of gone around the block, the three pyramids, three parts of the pyramid: the organization, the workforce, and then this particular segment. If there's CEOs that's listening in today, and lots of times we do have senior leaders that are part of this conversation, what advice would you give them as it relates to, say, women in general?
Yeah.
And development.
I think that we have a unique opportunity to make the workplace better than we found it. And that's, you think about a car ride, Ron, and we all might be riding in the car together, going to the same place, but we experience that car ride differently, right? Some people in the workplace will only ever drive the car, right? They don't even know what it feels like to sit in the middle seat. They don't know, some people only get a chance to ride shotgun. And for our CEOs, think about what it's like to two things can be true at the same time. You may never experience some of the things that we're talking about today, but somebody that works underneath you, somebody that you hired, or somebody that's in the organization might experience some of these inequalities. So what could you possibly do to move that needle forward? And You know, it's everyday actions. It's investing, giving the resources to your supervisor so that they're investing. And so be the model that those people need to see. It starts with the top and it works it down. And so let's be the mirror of the organization. Yeah. If we're demonstrating equity and diversity and inclusion, then that will trickle down. So I do think that we need to have more role models at the top mirroring what good looks like.
Yeah. My advice to that would be for leaders to listen more. There was a CEO here for a major grocery chain, Choitrums. For people in the Middle East, they know what I'm talking about. When COVID hit and everybody was trying to figure out what we're going to do, that we're going to lock down, he gave his email address to all of his employees. He says, I don't know everything. I don't know. But if you have something that you're concerned with, send me an email. Now, I don't know what happened beyond that, but just think of the connecting that people are struggling and they have to come to work every day because these were essential workers. But your CEO says, I'm willing to listen and talk to me.
Yep.
And so we talk about living, eating, breathing, and sleeping it. That's what I talk about. You have to make sure that you're living what you're saying, as opposed to getting up on an email or sending an email out or releasing a press release, and people that work for you are looking at this and saying, please, this is just another thing, flavor of the month, and it'll be something.
Read it.
Yeah, and it'll be something else. So, any other comments before we close out?
You know, I just think that we all have a great opportunity to really be thoughtful, be intentional about how we want the workforce to look like, feel like, for people to experience. We always really focus on the customer journey sometimes, but what about the employee journey, the employee experience? You know, if we all did have a glass door type of, scenario in the chat room, what would people say about working for you or working there? And so let's get those reviews better. Let's do what it takes to make sure that everybody's having a good employee experience. And I just be thoughtful of that, because at one point you might have been in their shoes, right? I think sometimes when you get to the top level of your career, you forget what it's like to be on the front line. And so let's humanize the workplace.
Okay, cool. Thank you, Minda. If I would like for you to follow her on LinkedIn. She has a great show. Is it every Monday?
Every Monday at noon.
Every Monday at noon. She has interesting guests. It's a half-hour show, kind of a lunch break show, at least for lunch break for US. So be sure and tune in, connect with her, listen to her. Minda, thank you so much for being a guest on the CEO series, and we will talk later.
Thank you
so much.
Thanks.
Okay. Stay tuned.